She had been invisible her entire life, dismissed by 10 suitors in a single evening, until the one man society feared most saw exactly what they had all missed. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We did love to hear from you. If you enjoy Victorian-era tale stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Haverton Hall glowed under 1,000 candles that night, their flames caught and magnified in the crystal chandeliers overhead, casting golden light across the polished parquet floors, where couples moved in graceful patterns that seemed choreographed by fate itself. Each step a promise, each turn a declaration that they belonged precisely where they stood. The air shimmered with the scent of hothouse roses and orange blossom, threaded through with expensive perfumes and the living warmth of bodies in motion, while the string quartet played a waltz so achingly beautiful it seemed designed to make anyone standing alone feel the absence of a partner, like a physical wound. Lady Joan Shepherd stood at the very edge of the ballroom in her carefully chosen ivory gown, a color her mother had selected to suggest purity and softness, though Joan suspected it only made her look washed out and insignificant against the jewel-toned silks of the other young ladies, and watched with practiced composure as the 7th suitor of the evening turned away from her with barely concealed relief, already scanning the room for anyone, more interesting than the too quiet, too serious girl who had just failed, once again, to be what was wanted. This was her 2nd season, a fact that should not have felt like a confession of failure, but somehow did, each ball a fresh opportunity to prove herself worthy of notice, each dance card a ledger of her inadequacy, each polite smile from her mother's friends a knife wrapped in silk. 22 years old, possessed of what her aunt generously called a gentle disposition, and what Joan privately understood to be a crippling inability to sparkle on command. Cursed with the kind of thoughtful silence that men interpreted not as depth, but as dullness, she had become the girl who watched from the margins while life happened to everyone else. The 7th rejection had been preceded by 6 others, each one a small death, each refusal delivered with the kind of studied politeness that somehow made the dismissal worse than outright cruelty would have been. Too reserved, the first had explained to his friend within her hearing. Too plain, the 2nd had murmured. Rather like a governess, isn't she? The 3rd had observed with a laugh that had carried across 3 conversations. By the 5th, Joan had stopped trying to charm them and had simply endured their presence, knowing before they opened their mouths that she had already been judged and found wanting. The 6th had at least been honest, telling her directly that he sought a wife with more animation, more liveliness, as though she were a puppet whose strings had gone slack. And then came Mr. Whitmore, the 7th, who had approached with what she desperately wanted to believe was genuine interest, only to excuse himself after precisely 4 minutes of conversation, during which she'd made the fatal error of mentioning a book she'd recently read, and watched his expression shift from polite attention to profound boredom. She had not expected the 8th, 9th, and 10th rejections to follow in such rapid succession, each one more public than the last, until the entire ballroom seemed to be watching her slow-motion social execution with a mixture of pity and fascination. Lord Ashford had at least been subtle in his withdrawal. Mr. Lennox had been less so, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the dance floor when the music changed and he simply walked away. But it was Sir Gregory Thorne, the 10th, who delivered the coup de grace, loudly declaring to his assembled friends that Joan was charming enough in a quiet way, I suppose, but far too dull, too unremarkable, utterly forgettable. Really. And the words had landed like blows, each syllable stripping away another layer of the dignity she'd been clinging to with increasingly desperate hands. Her mother stood on the far side of the ballroom, surrounded by other matrons whose daughters had already secured advantageous matches, and even from this distance Joan could read the disappointment carved into every line of her face, could feel the weight of her family's expectations pressing down like a physical force. Her father's gambling debts a shadow that followed them everywhere. Her younger brother's education dependent upon Joan making a match that would restore their dwindling fortune and secure their place in a society that forgot failures with brutal efficiency. Now she stood here, the most rejected woman in the room, perhaps in all of London, watching the very men who had dismissed her laugh and dance with girls who knew how to be exactly what was wanted, who had mastered the art of being decoratively empty. And Joan felt something inside her begin to crack, felt the careful composure she'd maintained throughout this nightmare of an evening start to splinter. What she did not know, what she could not possibly have known as she turned to flee the ballroom before the tears she'd been holding back could fall where everyone would see, was that someone had been watching her throughout the entire ordeal, counting each rejection with a cold fury that would have terrified anyone who knew enough to recognize it. At the far end of the ballroom, half hidden in the shadows near the terrace doors where the candlelight barely reached, stood a figure that most of society had learned not to look at directly, a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm front, whose very presence could silence a room and send even the bravest gentleman stepping carefully aside. Lord Ralph Garcia, the Black Wolf of Westmere, the most feared nobleman in England, had arrived late to the ball as he always did, had taken his customary position in the shadows where he could observe without participating, and had watched with growing intensity as Lady Joan Shepherd, a woman he'd noticed months ago for reasons he'd refused to examine too closely, suffered humiliation after humiliation with a quiet grace that made something twist painfully in his chest. He had counted each rejection, catalogued each slight, memorized every face that would later learn what it meant to earn his displeasure. And when Joan finally broke, when she turned toward the corridor leading to the retiring rooms with tears glistening on her lashes and her shoulders trembling with the effort of holding herself together, Ralph moved with the silent purposefulness of a predator who had finally decided to claim what was his, following her into the dimly lit hallway where the sounds of the ballroom faded to a distant murmur, where the shadows gathered thick enough to hide heartbreak, and the walls absorbed the sound of carefully stifled sobs. She did not hear him approach. He had learned long ago how to move without sound. But she felt his presence like a change in atmospheric pressure, felt the weight of someone's attention in a way she had not experienced all evening, and when she turned, expecting perhaps a concerned friend or a pitying chaperone, she found herself face to face with the man society called a monster, the lord whose name was spoken in whispers and whose dark eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that should have been frightening but instead felt strangely, impossibly safe. "Lady Joan," he said, and his voice was quiet, controlled, carrying none of the smoothness of the men who had rejected her, but rather a raw honesty that made her breath catch. "You deserve far better than any man in that room." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like vulnerability despite the fearsome reputation that clung to him like armor. "And whether they know it or not, whether you believe it or not," his dark eyes held hers, unwavering, "you are mine." Joan stepped back instinctively, her spine meeting the cool wall behind her, though whether she was retreating from his words or from the way they made something flutter dangerously in her chest, she could not say. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice still thick with unshed tears. "You don't even know me, Lord Garcia. Why would you—" She stopped, shaking her head as though she could physically dislodge the absurdity of the situation. "Why would you, of all people, care what happens to me?" Ralph remained exactly where he stood, making no move to close the distance between them, though his dark eyes never left her face. "Did any of them touch you?" The question was delivered with such controlled precision that it took Joan a moment to register the violence coiled beneath it. "Did any man lay hands on you in dismissal or disrespect?" "No, Joan blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. They were merely unkind with their words. "Names." It was not a request. "Lord Garcia, you cannot possibly—" "I can." He said it with such absolute certainty that Joan felt her protest die in her throat. "I can challenge every man who made you feel less than you are. I can ensure that not one of them forgets the cost of treating you as though you were disposable." He paused, and something in his expression softened by a fraction, though his intensity remained unchanged. "But only if you wish it. I will not act without your consent." Joan stared at him. This man whose reputation had preceded him into every drawing-room in London, whose very name made strong men uncomfortable and mothers pull their daughters closer, and tried to reconcile that fearsome image with the person standing before her, asking permission before defending her honor. "I don't want duels," she managed finally. "I just want—" She trailed off, uncertain what she did want, beyond an end to this evening and perhaps the ability to disappear entirely. "Then we will return to the ballroom," Ralph said, as though it were the simplest thing in the world. "Together. That would only make things worse." "No." He extended his arm with deliberate formality. "It will make things very clear." Joan hesitated, her gloved hand hovering in the space between them. Everything she knew about Lord Ralph Garcia screamed danger. The duels, the ruthlessness, the ice-cold precision with which he'd reportedly destroyed men who'd crossed him. And yet standing here, in this dimly lit corridor, she felt safer than she had all evening, seen in a way she'd never experienced before, as though he'd looked past every inadequacy society had catalogued and found something worth claiming. She placed her hand on his arm. The ballroom fell silent the moment they appeared in the doorway, not the gradual hush of polite attention, but the sharp, shocked silence of scandal unfolding in real time. Ralph guided her forward with unhurried confidence, his posture making it abundantly clear that he was not simply escorting a distressed young lady back to a chaperone, but rather making a deliberate, public declaration. Conversations died mid-sentence. Dancers stumbled in their steps. Even the orchestra seemed to falter for half a beat. Joan felt every eye in the room turn toward them, felt the weight of society's collective judgment like a physical force, but Ralph's steady presence beside her kept her from fleeing. He walked her directly across the center of the ballroom, not skirting the edges as she'd done all evening, but claiming the space with absolute authority, and delivered her to where her mother stood frozen among the matrons, her face cycling rapidly through shock, confusion, and something that looked dangerously like calculation. "Lady Shepherd," Ralph said with perfect formality, inclining his head, "I trust I return your daughter to you safely." He turned to Joan, and for just a moment his expression warmed by a degree that only she could see. "Until we meet again, Lady Joan." He was gone before Joan could respond, disappearing back into the shadows at the edge of the ballroom, but the damage, or perhaps the salvation, was already done. The whispers started immediately, a rising tide of speculation and scandal that washed through the assembled guests like wildfire. Her mother's hand closed around Joan's arm with bruising force. "What?" she hissed, her smile never faltering for the benefit of those watching. "Have you done to attract him?" The morning papers arrived with breakfast, and Joan's mother read them with the kind of silence that preceded storms. One by one, she set the scandal sheets on the table between the toast and marmalade, each headline more lurid than the last. "The Black Wolf claims his prize. Lord Garcia's mysterious interest. Which unfortunate lady has caught Westmere's dark attention?" They didn't name her directly. Society's columnists were too clever for outright libel, but anyone who'd attended last night's ball would know exactly which lady they meant. "This is a disaster," her mother said finally, her teacup rattling against its saucer. "Lord Garcia is not the sort of man one wishes attention from. He's dangerous, Joan, ruthless. There are rumors—" "I know the rumors," Joan interrupted quietly. She'd heard them all, the duel at 17 that had left a man permanently scarred, the cousin exiled over some unnamed offense, The political enemies who'd learned too late that crossing Ralph Garcia meant complete and utter ruin. But he was nothing but courteous to me. Courteous? Her father looked up from his own paper, his face pale. The man could destroy us with a word if you displease him. We cannot afford his enmity, but neither can we afford his interest. Joan opened her mouth to respond, but a knock at the door silenced the entire table. The butler entered, bearing a silver tray with a single cream envelope, sealed with black wax and an unfamiliar crest. "For Lady Joan," he announced, his voice carefully neutral in a way that suggested he'd already read the sender's name. Joan broke the seal with trembling fingers. The message inside was brief, written in strong, decisive handwriting. "Lady Joan, I intend to court you with your family's permission and society's knowledge. My call will be formal, my intentions honorable, and my interest non-negotiable. Lord Ralph Garcia." The letter slipped from her fingers. Around London, she would later learn, similar scenes were unfolding in drawing rooms across Mayfair. By noon, 3 of the previous night's rejectors had sent desperate notes of apology. Mr. Whitmore arrived in person, his face ashen, stammering something about reconsidering his hasty judgment. Lord Ashford sent flowers. Even Sir Gregory Thorne, who'd called her forgettable just hours ago, penned a letter claiming he'd been misunderstood and hoped she'd accept his renewed admiration. Joan read each message with growing bewilderment until her lady's maid, Sarah, leaned close while arranging her hair. "If you'll pardon my saying so, miss," Sarah whispered. "Cook heard from Lady Pemberton's housekeeper that some of last night's gentlemen were encouraged to look elsewhere before they ever approached you." Joan's hands stilled. "What do you mean, encouraged?" "Can't say for certain, miss, but there's talk of someone wanting you kept available for a wealthier match. Someone who didn't count on Lord Garcia noticing." Sarah's reflection in the mirror looked troubled. Might be nothing but servant gossip, though. But Joan's mind was already racing, replaying each rejection, searching for patterns she'd been too humiliated to see. Had she been deliberately sabotaged? And if so, by whom? That afternoon, her mother insisted she attend Lady Havisham's garden party. "We must show society you're unaffected by this scandal." And Joan found herself standing near the refreshment table when 2 matrons passed close enough for their voices to carry. "He never courts anyone," the first whispered urgently. "Not in 10 years. Not since—" She stopped abruptly, glancing around. "So why her? Why now?" "Perhaps," the second replied with barely concealed malice, "he simply enjoys collecting broken things." Joan's teacup froze halfway to her lips, the words landing like physical blows. But beneath the hurt bloomed something else entirely, a burning need to understand what everyone else seemed to know about the man who'd claimed her as his, and what secrets lay buried in the past that made even mentioning them require hushed voices and fearful glances. The invitation arrived the next morning, formal and precise. "Lord Ralph Garcia requests the pleasure of Lady Joan Shepherd's company for a promenade in Hyde Park at 3 o'clock, with appropriate chaperonage." Her mother had nearly fainted at the audacity of it. A public walk in broad daylight, where all of society could witness. But her father's mounting debts left them little choice but to accept. Joan found Ralph waiting at the park's entrance precisely at 3, dressed in dark grey that somehow made him appear even more imposing against the spring greenery. Her maid trailed at a respectable distance as he offered his arm, and they began walking the well-trodden path where other couples strolled in careful display. "You're wearing gloves again," Joan observed after several moments of silence. "You always do, even indoors when other gentlemen remove theirs." Ralph's stride faltered almost imperceptibly. "An old habit." "A careful one," she corrected gently. "Like the way you position yourself with your back to walls, or how you arrive late to balls so you can observe before being observed." She glanced up at him, catching the surprise in his expression before he could mask it. You move through society like you're expecting an attack. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, because I learned the hard way that attacks come from the places one least expects them. He paused beneath an oak tree, turning to face her fully. Which is why I must warn you. My interest in you, public as I've made it, has painted a target on your back. There are men who would hurt you simply to hurt me. Then why claim me at all? The question emerged sharper than she'd intended. Why not let me remain invisible as I was? Because you were never invisible to me. His dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. And because I've spent 10 years ensuring I care for nothing, that no one could be used against me. It was safer that way. Lonelier, but safer. Something flickered across his face. Vulnerability, quickly shuttered. You've rather complicated that strategy, Lady Joan. I didn't ask to be your complication. No, he agreed. But here we are nonetheless. He resumed walking, his tone shifting to something more instructional. If anyone approaches you with questions about me, about my business or my associations, you will deflect. Compliment their gown, mention the weather, become suddenly fascinated by a distant bird. I don't care how you do it, but you give them nothing. You're teaching me espionage at a garden party? I'm teaching you survival. His voice carried an edge now. Society is a battlefield, Lady Joan, and you've been fighting it unarmed your entire life. That ends now. He guided her around a bend in the path. When someone tries to isolate you in conversation, keep moving. When they offer seemingly innocent gossip, remember that information flows both directions. When they compliment you excessively, they're often softening you for a harder question. Joan absorbed this, recognizing the truth in his words even as they unsettled her. You speak from experience. Bitter experience. He stopped again, and this time when he looked at her, she saw past the fearsome reputation to the exhaustion beneath it. The weariness of someone who'd been vigilant for so long that he'd forgotten how to rest. I don't wish that same education for you, but I cannot protect you from what I've set in motion by claiming you publicly. So I will give you the tools to protect yourself. Lord Garcia. Ralph, he interrupted quietly. When we're alone, relatively alone, you may call me Ralph. The intimacy of it stole her response. She simply nodded, and they walked in companionable silence until her maid signaled it was time to depart. Ralph escorted her back to her carriage, handed her up with careful formality, and stepped back as the driver prepared to leave. But as the carriage pulled away, Joan glanced back and saw Ralph's expression shift, his gaze fixed not on her, but on something behind her carriage. His hand moved unconsciously toward his coat, where a gentleman might carry a weapon, before he seemed to catch himself. She turned to look through the rear window. A man on horseback maintained careful distance behind them, his face shadowed by his hat, following their route with deliberate precision. Joan insisted on seeing Ralph the next morning, propriety be damned. She arrived at his townhouse with only her maid, ignoring the shocked look from his butler, and demanded an audience. When Ralph appeared in his study doorway, still in shirt sleeves as though he'd been working through the night, his expression shifted from surprise to something darker. You saw him, he said. Not a question. I saw someone following my carriage, yes. Joan moved past him into the study without waiting for invitation. Who was he, Ralph? And don't tell me it was coincidence. Ralph closed the door, leaving it slightly ajar for propriety's sake, and leaned against his desk with the weariness of a man who'd been dreading this conversation. His name is irrelevant. What matters is who sent him, Lord Nathaniel Blackwood, a man who has considerable reason to wish me harm. Because of business, politics, because of betrayal. The word emerged rough, as though dragged from somewhere deep and carefully buried. Ralph turned away, staring out the window at the London street below. 7 years ago, I was different. Younger, certainly. More trusting. Foolishly so. He paused, his jaw tightening. There was a woman. Lady Victoria Ashmont. Beautiful, charming. Seemingly everything society claimed a perfect match should be. Joan felt something twist in her chest, but remained silent, letting him speak. I was convinced I loved her, Ralph continued, his voice carefully controlled. Convinced enough to share things I should have kept guarded. Business arrangements, political alliances, information about my family's holdings. She listened with such apparent devotion. His laugh was bitter. What I didn't know was that she was Blackwood's mistress, had been for years, and every word I spoke to her in confidence was delivered to him before the night ended. Ralph. They used what I'd told her to destroy a business partnership that had taken my father years to build. Worse, they fabricated documents suggesting I'd been involved in fraud, nearly had me brought up on charges that would have meant ruin or exile. His hands gripped the windowsill, knuckles white. When I discovered the truth, I confronted Victoria. She laughed, Joan, laughed and told me I'd been pathetically easy to manipulate. That's monstrous. That's not even the worst of it. Ralph turned to face her now, and for the first time she saw real fear in his eyes. Blackwood challenged me to a duel, wanted to finish what they'd started. I accepted, because I was young and angry, and convinced I had nothing left to lose. He didn't fight fair, had a man waiting in the trees with a pistol while we faced each other with swords. He touched his left side unconsciously. The shot should have been fatal, would have been if I hadn't moved at precisely the right moment. As it was, I spent 3 months recovering, another 6 rebuilding everything they'd destroyed. Joan crossed the room slowly, stopping just before him. And you've trusted no one since. I couldn't afford to. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. For 10 years I've kept everyone at a distance. No attachments, no vulnerabilities, no one who could be used as leverage or weapon against me. It was necessary. Was? He looked at her then with such raw honesty that she felt her breath catch. You changed everything the moment I saw you defend that servant girl last season. I'd gone to that garden party specifically to observe Lord Pemberton, had no interest in the social niceties. But there you were, quietly insisting that a young maid shouldn't be dismissed for dropping a tray, offering to pay for the broken china from your own pin money. His hand lifted, hovering near her face without quite touching. No one was watching. You had nothing to gain. You were simply kind. And I realized I'd spent so long building walls that I'd forgotten what genuine goodness looked like. Ralph, I'm not. You are. His fingers finally brushed her cheek, the touch feather-light and achingly gentle. And Blackwood knows it now. He's watched me for 7 years, waiting for an opening, waiting for something or someone I might actually care about. Now he's found it. Joan's hand rose to cover his, holding it against her face. Then we'll face him together. You don't understand the danger. I understand perfectly. She stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. I understand that you've been alone for too long, that you've carried this fear and this anger until they've nearly consumed you. I understand that you're terrified of what caring for me might cost. Her other hand found his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palm. But I also understand that I've been invisible my entire life, and you see me. That matters more than any threat. Ralph's forehead dropped to rest against hers, his breath unsteady. For a long moment they stood there, hands touching, hearts pounding, the space between them charged with everything unspoken. I fear nothing in this world, he whispered finally, his voice breaking on the words. Nothing except losing you. The truth arrived in the form of a tearful confession from Miss Arabella Winters, who appeared at the Shepherd townhouse 3 days later with her mother conspicuously absent. Joan received her in the drawing-room, curiosity overriding her confusion at the unexpected visit. I cannot bear it any more, Arabella burst out before Joan could even offer tea. What my mother did to you, what she made me, complicit in, it's unconscionable. Her hands twisted in her lap. The rejections that night, Lady Joan, at least 6 of them were arranged. Joan felt the room tilt slightly. Arranged? My mother wanted you eliminated from consideration. Arabella's voice dropped to a miserable whisper. Lord Harrington, the wealthy Earl from Derbyshire, had been seen speaking with you at several events. Mother convinced herself he was developing an interest, and she wanted that match for me. So she spread rumors, told the gentleman you were peculiar, unsuitable, that your family's finances were worse than they actually are. She even suggested you had an understanding with a country vicar and were only attending balls to avoid disappointing your mother. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity, the similar wording of some rejections, the way certain men had seemed almost apologetic, as though they'd been given information that demanded they withdraw. 6 rejections, Joan repeated numbly. Which ones? Arabella listed them, including Mr. Whitmore and Lord Ashford. The others may have been genuine disinterest, but these 6... Lady Joan, I'm so sorry. I tried to tell Mother it was wrong, but she insisted it was simply strategic positioning and that you'd find someone eventually. Her eyes welled with fresh tears. Then Lord Garcia claimed you, and Mother has been terrified ever since. She knows if he discovers what she did, he'll destroy her, Joan finished quietly. She thought of Ralph's cold fury, his willingness to duel anyone who'd hurt her. Thank you for telling me, Miss Winters. I know it wasn't easy. After Arabella departed, Joan sat in the silence of the drawing room, rage and vindication warring in her chest. She'd been sabotaged. Her humiliation had been manufactured, deliberate, a casualty of another woman's ambition. When Ralph arrived an hour later, they'd established a pattern of afternoon visits. She told him everything. His reaction was precisely what she'd expected. His expression went cold and deadly, the fearsome black wolf rising to the surface. I will ruin her, he said with chilling certainty. By week's end, Mrs. Winters will find herself unwelcome in every drawing room in London. Her husband's business connections will mysteriously dissolve. Her daughter's prospects will... No! Joan stood, placing herself directly in his path. You won't. Joan, this is my battle, Ralph. Mine. She straightened her spine, calling upon every lesson he'd taught her about navigating society's treacherous waters. You've given me the tools to protect myself. Now let me use them to defend myself. Something shifted in his expression, concern wrestling with understanding. What are you planning? To face her, publicly, at Lady Ashford's ball tomorrow night. Joan's hands were trembling, but her voice remained steady. I'm going to let everyone see exactly what she tried to do, and I'm going to do it without threats or intimidation. Just truth, spoken clearly. Ralph studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll be there. Not to intervene, but to watch. The next evening, Joan entered Lady Ashford's ballroom wearing deep sapphire silk instead of her usual pale colors, her chin high and her composure absolute. She'd timed her arrival perfectly, late enough to make an entrance, early enough to catch Mrs. Winters before the woman could retreat. Ralph stood at his customary position in the shadows, his presence a silent anchor. Joan crossed directly to where Mrs. Winters held court among a group of matrons. Mrs. Winters, she said clearly, her voice carrying just far enough. I wonder if you might explain to our friends here why you told 6 gentlemen that I was secretly engaged to a country vicar. I'm curious what fictional details you provided. The color drained from Mrs. Winters' face. Around them, conversation stopped. I'm sure I don't know what you... Your daughter was kind enough to confess the entire scheme, Joan continued with devastating calm. The rumors, the strategic sabotage, your determination to remove me as competition for Lord Harrington's attention. She paused, letting the words settle. I merely wonder if you considered what teaching your daughter such behavior might cost her in character what it gained her in prospects. Mrs. Winters' mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The surrounding matrons had gone perfectly still, their expressions ranging from shock to vindication. Mrs. Winters had never been particularly liked. Joan turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Mrs. Winters, Lord Harrington announced his engagement last week, to a lady from Yorkshire. So it was all rather pointless, wasn't it?" She walked away with perfect grace, feeling the weight of 100 eyes following her, hearing the whispers beginning to rise like a tide. And when she glanced toward the shadows where Ralph stood, she found him watching her with an expression she'd never seen before, something raw and wondering and achingly tender, as though he was seeing her for the first time and falling utterly, irreversibly in love. Sir Gregory Thorne arrived at the Shepherd townhouse precisely 3 days after Joan's public confrontation with Mrs. Winters, his card trembling slightly in the butler's hand, as though even the paper sensed his nervousness. Joan considered refusing him, but curiosity, and perhaps a small desire for closure, made her accept. He stood when she entered the drawing-room, his face pale and sheened with perspiration despite the cool morning air. "Lady Joan, I am profoundly grateful you agreed to see me. I cannot imagine why I wouldn't," Joan said with deliberate mildness, taking her seat and folding her hands in her lap. "After all, we're practically old friends. Or were you not the gentleman who called me utterly forgettable in front of half the ballroom?" Gregory flinched as though she'd struck him. "I've come to apologize for those words. I was—" He stopped, seeming to gather himself. "I was inexcusably cruel, and I have thought of little else since that terrible evening. How exhausting for you." Joan kept her voice pleasant, almost sympathetic, which somehow made the words cut deeper. "Lady Joan, please." He took a step forward, then seemed to think better of it. "I spoke rashly, without consideration for your feelings. The truth is, you are not forgettable at all. In fact, I've come to realize that you possess many qualities I failed to appreciate in the moment. Your gentleness, your thoughtfulness, my sudden association with Lord Garcia," Joan supplied quietly. The blood drained from Gregory's face. That's not— "Please don't insult me further with lies, Sir Gregory." She stood, forcing him to look up slightly to meet her eyes. "You called me forgettable when you believed I was nobody. Now you've discovered I'm under the protection of the most feared man in London, and suddenly I'm memorable enough to warrant a personal apology, and what I suspect is an incoming marriage proposal." "You don't understand the position I'm in," Gregory said desperately. "Lord Garcia has made it known. That is, there are rumors that anyone who wronged you will face consequences. I have business interests that could be affected, family connections that might— So you're here out of fear, not regret." Joan felt something settle in her chest, a final piece of her old self clicking into place and breaking away simultaneously. "You're not apologizing because you hurt me, Sir Gregory. You're apologizing because you're terrified of what he might do to you." "Can you blame me?" The words burst out of him. "The man is dangerous. He's ruined better men than me for lesser offenses. I cannot afford his enmity, Lady Joan. Surely you understand that a connection to you now, through marriage or courtship, would secure my safety from his— Get out." The quiet command stopped him mid-sentence. Joan walked to the drawing-room door and opened it, her hand steady on the brass handle. "You will leave my home, Sir Gregory. You will not return, and you will consider yourself fortunate that I don't relay this conversation to Lord Garcia, because unlike you, I don't use people's fear as currency. Lady Joan, please be reasonable." "I am being perfectly reasonable." Her voice never rose above conversational level, but steel ran through every word. "I'm telling you that I have no interest in a man who values me only when I'm protected by someone more powerful than him. I deserve better than that. I've always deserved better than that." She held his gaze steadily, even when I was too hurt and too desperate to believe it myself. Gregory stared at her as though seeing her for the first time, then grabbed his hat and fled with what little dignity remained to him. Joan closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding but her hands remarkably steady. She heard the soft sound of footsteps and turned to find Ralph emerging from the morning room adjacent to the drawing room, where he'd apparently been present for the entire exchange. The door between the rooms had been left ajar, whether deliberately or by accident, she couldn't say. "How long were you there?" she asked. "Long enough." He crossed to her slowly, his dark eyes searching her face. "When he arrived, I was already here discussing some business matters with your father. I heard his name announced, and I—" He paused, something almost like embarrassment flickering across his features. "I wanted to hear what he would say. What you would say. Eavesdropping, Lord Garcia?" "Protecting what's mine," he corrected softly. Then his expression shifted to something she couldn't quite name. Wonder mixed with a pride so fierce it made her breath catch. "Though I see now you need far less protecting than I imagined." Joan felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I learned from an excellent teacher." Ralph reached out, his fingertips brushing her jaw with the same devastating gentleness he'd shown before. His eyes held hers, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, as though the words were meant for himself as much as her. "You were never forgettable." The letter arrived on heavy cream paper, unsigned but unmistakably vicious. "Does the foolish girl know what manner of monster she's attached herself to? How many men has the Black Wolf destroyed? How many lives ruined? She should ask him about the blood on his hands before she lets him touch her with them." It was the fifth such letter that week. Joan had hidden the others from her family, but this one, with its deliberate cruelty, its implicit threat, finally broke something inside her that had been fracturing since the night of 10 rejections. She found herself in her room, gasping for air that wouldn't come, tears streaming down her face as weeks of pressure and scrutiny and constant vigilance collapsed inward. Her maid found her there and, against all protocol, sent directly for Lord Garcia. Ralph arrived within 20 minutes, taking the stairs 2 at a time in a manner that would have scandalized anyone who saw. He found Joan in the drawing room where her mother had moved her, still shaking, the letter crumpled in her fist. "Everyone out," he said quietly, and the command in his voice sent even Joan's mother retreating, though she left the door conspicuously ajar. Ralph knelt before Joan's chair, his hands carefully not touching her. "Tell me what happened." "I can't do this." The words tumbled out between sobs. "I'm not strong enough for this, Ralph. Society is tearing me apart because of you, and I don't—" Her voice broke. "I don't understand why you chose me. I'm nobody. I'm the girl everyone overlooked, everyone dismissed. You could have anyone. Someone worthy of the attention. Someone who wouldn't crumble under the pressure of being associated with you." "Stop." His hands finally moved, cupping her face gently, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Stop diminishing yourself as though you're still that girl, standing alone at the edge of the ballroom. You're not her anymore." "Yes, I am. I'm exactly her, just with better clothes and a dangerous man's protection. You are the woman who defended a servant girl when you thought no one was watching." The words came out fierce, almost angry. "It was last spring at the Pemberton garden party. You were standing by the fountain when a maid dropped a tray of glasses. Lady Pemberton was screaming at the poor girl, threatening to dismiss her without references. Everyone else pretended not to notice. It was easier to look away. But you stepped forward." Joan stared at him, the memory surfacing slowly through her tears. "You told Lady Pemberton the girl had been startled by a bee," Ralph continued, his voice softening. "You offered to pay for the broken glasses from your own allowance. You treated that maid like she mattered, like her livelihood and dignity were worth defending, even though helping her gained you nothing and potentially made you a target for Lady Pemberton's displeasure." His thumbs brushed away her tears with infinite care. "I was there on business, had no interest in the social niceties. But I saw you, and I spent the next 6 months trying desperately to forget what I'd seen, because you terrified me. I terrified you. You made me feel something other than anger for the first time in 7 years." His voice cracked slightly. I tried to stay away. I attended different events, avoided places you might be. I told myself you were just another society lady, that your kindness was performance. He laughed bitterly. Then I saw you at that ball, watching you endure rejection after rejection with such quiet dignity, and I realized I'd been lying to myself. I couldn't stay away. I didn't want to stay away anymore. Ralph, you think you're unworthy of me. His forehead dropped to rest against hers. Joan, I'm a man who's spent a decade perfecting the art of being feared. I've destroyed careers, ruined reputations, kept everyone at a distance because trust was a luxury I couldn't afford. I've built my entire life around being untouchable, unreachable. His voice dropped to a whisper. And then you walked into my carefully controlled world and made me want to be something other than feared. You made me want to be trusted. By you. Only you. Joan's hands rose to cover his where they still cradled her face. I'm so afraid of failing you. You couldn't possibly. He pulled back slightly, just enough to hold her gaze fully. These letters, these attacks, they're not about your worthiness. They're about mine. Society knows that anyone who can make the Black Wolf care is dangerous in ways I've never been. You've done what no political enemy or business rival ever managed. You've given me something to lose. That's what frightens me most, she whispered, that I'll be the weakness that destroys you. Then let me be clear. His eyes blazed with an intensity that stole her breath. Let them send their toxic letters. Let them whisper and scheme and try to drive wedges between us. Let them fear me. I've never cared what society thinks of my reputation. His voice gentled, becoming almost reverent. You, only you, I wish to trust me. And if society cannot accept that the monster they've created has found someone who sees past the darkness to the man beneath. He paused, and something achingly vulnerable crossed his features. Then society can burn, for all I care, as long as you're standing beside me when it does. Joan felt the last of her composure shatter, but this time the breaking felt like healing. She leaned into him, her forehead against his shoulder, and felt his arms come around her with a protectiveness that was somehow fierce and gentle all at once. Neither of them spoke the word that hung between them, suspended in the charged silence, but both of them felt it. The Duchess of Marlborough's spring ball was the pinnacle of the London season, an event where reputations were made or shattered beneath chandeliers that rivaled the stars themselves. Joan stood at the entrance in emerald silk, Ralph's favorite color, though he'd never said so aloud. She'd simply noticed the way his eyes lingered when she wore it, and felt the familiar flutter of anxiety as hundreds of faces turned toward her. Then Ralph's hand settled at the small of her back, steady and sure, and the anxiety transformed into something else entirely. Determination. Ready, he murmured, close enough that his breath stirred the hair at her temple. With you? Always. They entered together, not with the careful distance propriety demanded, but side by side, Ralph's claim unmistakable in every line of his posture. The ballroom's conversations didn't merely pause, they died completely, replaced by a silence so profound that Joan could hear the rustle of her own skirts against the marble floor. Ralph guided her to the center of the room, the exact spot where couples took the floor for the first dance. The orchestra faltered. The Duchess herself looked uncertain whether to be scandalized or fascinated. "My lords, ladies," Ralph said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the vast space with the same commanding presence he wielded in Parliament. "I find I have an announcement that cannot wait for more private channels." His hand moved from Joan's back to her hand, lifting it with deliberate ceremony. "I am formally declaring my intention to court Lady Joan Shepherd with every expectation that she will do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife." The silence shattered into chaos. Gasps, whispers, a few shocked exclamations. Joan felt the weight of every eye in the room but kept her chin high, her hand steady in Ralph's. "Furthermore," Ralph continued, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "I wish to address certain rumors that have circulated regarding Lady Joan's character and connections." His gaze swept the crowd with lethal precision, landing on Mrs. Winters, who had gone white as chalk. "It has come to my attention that a campaign of deliberate sabotage was waged against Lady Joan during her season. Lies spread, suitors warned away, reputations impugned, all orchestrated by individuals who saw her as competition rather than recognizing her as the remarkable woman she is." Mrs. Winters made a small sound of distress. Her husband looked murderous. Whether at Ralph or at his wife, Joan couldn't tell. "These schemes have been documented," Ralph continued with chilling calm. "Names recorded, evidence preserved. I share this not as threat but as clarity. Lady Joan Shepherd is under my protection, and any future attempts to harm her reputation or happiness will be met with the full weight of my attention." The pause before the last word made several people visibly flinch. "I trust I make myself clear." The crowd murmured agreement, fear and fascination mixed in equal measure. Ralph turned back to Joan, and his expression transformed entirely, the fearsome lord disappearing to reveal something achingly tender. "Now, if the lady will grant me the honor, I believe the orchestra is ready for a waltz." "I don't know how," Joan whispered as he led her into position. "I was never asked to dance enough to learn properly." "Then I'll teach you." His hand settled at her waist. "As you've taught me so much." They moved together as the music began, Ralph guiding her through steps she'd only watched others perform. Around them, other couples gradually joined the dance, but Joan barely noticed. Her world had narrowed to the man before her, to the way he looked at her as though she was something precious and rare. "Do you remember," Ralph said quietly, "when you asked me why I claimed you that night? You said I deserved better than any man in that room. I meant it, but it wasn't the whole truth." His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "The whole truth is that from the moment I saw you defend that servant girl, from the moment I realized what you were, truly kind, genuinely good, quietly brave, I was lost. I told myself I was watching you to understand you, to categorize you, to file you away as just another society lady." His voice dropped lower. "But I was lying to myself. I was watching you because I couldn't look away, because you were the first person in 10 years who made me want to be something other than feared. Ralph, let me finish." He spun her gently, bringing her back closer than before. "That night, watching you suffer those rejections, I wasn't angry on your behalf. I mean, I was, but that wasn't all of it. I was terrified that you'd believe them, that you'd let their blindness convince you that you were forgettable, when the truth is you've been unforgettable to me since the moment I first saw you." His hand tightened almost imperceptibly at her waist. "You were never their rejection, Joan. From the very beginning, whether you knew it or not, whether I was ready to admit it or not." He pulled her closer still, near enough that propriety became a distant consideration, close enough that she could see the vulnerability in his eyes that he'd let no one else witness. "You were mine." Joan felt tears prick her eyes, but these were nothing like the tears of humiliation she'd shed that terrible night. These were tears of recognition, of finally understanding that she'd never been unwanted, only unseen by men too shallow to recognize value when it stood before them. "And you?" she whispered, reaching up to touch his face with a boldness that would have been impossible months ago. "You were never the monster they claimed. You were just waiting for someone to see past the armor to the man beneath." Ralph's eyes closed briefly, as though her words had struck somewhere deep and previously unreachable. When he opened them again, Joan saw something she'd never expected to find in the Black Wolf of Westmere. "Hope. Dance with me," he murmured. "Dance with me tonight and every night after. Stand beside me when society whispers. Trust me when the world tells you I'm dangerous." His forehead touched hers, heedless of the watching crowd. "Love me. even though I've forgotten how to be anything other than feared, and I swear I will spend every day learning how to be worthy of you." "You already are," Joan said, and kissed him there in the center of the Duchess of Marlborough's ballroom, in front of 500 witnesses, scandal and propriety, forgotten in favor of something far more important. Truth. The ballroom erupted. Shock, delight, scandal, and grudging admiration swirling together in a cacophony of response. But Joan heard none of it. She heard only Ralph's sharp intake of breath, felt only his arms tightening around her as though he would never let go, knew only that she had finally, impossibly, found exactly where she belonged. In the arms of the man society feared most, who had looked at her and seen not plainness or inadequacy, but rather everything he'd been missing. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer rejected. She was, simply and completely, loved. And that, Joan thought as Ralph pulled her closer and the orchestra swelled into a crescendo that matched the thundering of her heart, was worth every moment of heartbreak that had led her here. Dear listeners, thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with someone close to you. Your support inspires us to keep creating stories filled with love, healing, and unforgettable twists.